This morning was found in Esther chapter 2, verses 19 to chapter 3, verse 15. Chapter 2, verse 19. Now when the virgins were gathered together the second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther had not made known her kindred or her people, as Mordecai had commanded her. For Esther obeyed Mordecai, just as when she was brought up by him. In those days, as Mordecai was sitting in the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And this came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told it to Queen Esther. And Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. When the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were both hanged on the gallows. And it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, and advanced him to set his throne above all the officials who were with him. And all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage. Then the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why do you transgress the king's command?" And when they spoke to him day after day, and he would not listen to them, they told Haman in order to see whether Mordecai's words would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. And when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage to him, Haman was filled with fury. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So as they had made known to him the people of Mordecai, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. In the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast that is, they cast lots, before Haman day after day, and they cast it month after month till the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. And then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, "There's a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of every other people, and do not keep the king's laws. So it is not the king's profit to tolerate them. If it please the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who have charge of the king's business, that they may put it into the king's treasuries." So the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, "The money is given to you, the people also, to do with them as it seems good to you." Then the king's scribes were summoned on the 13th day of the first month. An edict, according to all that Haman commanded, was written to the king's satraps and to the governors over all the provinces and to the officials of all the peoples, to every province in his own script and every people in his own language. It was written in the name of King Ahasuerus, sealed with the king's signet ring. Letters were sent by the couriers to all the king's provinces with instructions to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. A copy of the document was to be issued as a decree in every province by proclamation to all the peoples to be ready for that day. The couriers went out hurriedly by order of the king, and the decree was issued in Susa, the citadel. And the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was thrown into confusion. We'll have Wayne.
Thanks, Harry. Good morning, everyone. I'm glad to see you on this rainy Sunday morning as we continue in the book of Esther. And so I want to start off this morning just by talking about a kind of an interesting feature that we have here in the book of Esther. I really wanted to introduce this the first week, and then I was talking to Calvin about this. And then, for the second week, I'm like, okay, this third week, I did want to introduce this really interesting thing about the book of Esther that we're going to see as we go through it, this interesting feature. And the idea is that, as we go through this historical narrative of the book of Esther, one of the things that's really interesting about this book is the moral ambiguity of the book of Esther. And specifically, what I mean by that is that the book itself, right, when you read through the book of Esther, it never gives us any hint about whether or not God actually approves of the actions done by the people in the book. Right? And so that when you read through the book of Esther just records for us what happens. The author just says, this is what happens. But it never gives us so is that a good thing? Did God approve of that? Was that something that he was supposed to do or she was supposed to do? Or is that a sin? Is that not a sin? Right? The book of Esther just never, ever gives us a hint about whether or not these things are, what God thinks of these things or how we should think of these things. And, I think part of it is also that for many of us, most of our exposure to the book of Esther, perhaps, at least I know for me, is mostly through Sunday school. I might not have studied the book of Esther for 3 decades or 2 decades. Maybe the last time I studied the book of Esther was when my Sunday school teacher, brought it up and talked about it. And so, of course, when you talk about it with kids, appropriately, you're going to leave some details out. And, as a result, we often get the PG version of Esther. And when we really look into this book, it's really not a great book for kids, actually. There's, a lot of, kind of adult things that happen in this. And so, so for example, last week, and just to give you an example of kind of the moral ambiguity, right? And this is what the book of Esther forces us to do. It forces us to wrestle, with these things, right? What are we supposed to make of these things? So for example, last week, we talked about Esther being made queen, right? And there are pretty some non-kid-friendly details that we tend to leave out when we tell the story. For example, it's very likely that Esther was not given a choice when she was taken into the king's harem. Right, so the king, it says that he appointed officials to go out into the provinces to gather all the beautiful young virgins in the empire. And from the clues that we have in the previous chapter, it seems that Esther was taken against her will. Right, because the text actually says that the officials gathered them and that Esther was taken into the king's palace. Right, in doing so, Esther's entire life was changed. Right, no longer would she have the opportunity to marry a young Jewish guy and settle down and have a family. Right, she was living the rest of her life in the king's harem. Right, but not only that, and this is kind of where we get the PG version of the story, is that each of the women, right, they were taken after their beautification process, right, of 6 months or a year. Right, they were brought in one by one. Right, to spend a night with the king. Right, now, it doesn't say exactly what happened during that night, but it's also kind of just assumed, right, what happened. Right, and as we read through the book of Esther, we're just thinking about how many laws did Esther have to break? How many Jewish laws did Esther have to break in order to be where she is as queen of Persia? And not only that, being queen of Persia, right, how many additional laws, Jewish laws, does she have to break in order to stay where she is? But, this is also, and the frustration in the book of Esther is that we don't know, right? Does God approve of Esther's actions, right? Is it okay or is it not okay? And the book just never, really tells us. But at the same time, I think this is the brilliance of the book of Esther as well. It's the frustration in the book of Esther, right? Because we just want to know, what's the right answer? Is what she did right? Can we follow her example? Right, but this is also the brilliance of the book of Esther because it just doesn't tell us what God thinks. Right, so on the one hand, we want to defend Esther, right, because we want to say, well, she was taken against her will, right, and so she was simply doing what she needed to do to survive. Right, and surely you can't blame someone, for doing that, right? You can't blame Esther for doing that. Right, but on the other hand, you might argue, well, no, she should have said no. Right, she should have remained faithful to God no matter the consequences. Right, we just looked at the narrative of Daniel, right? And we saw Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. We saw Daniel, right, choose to say no to the king. And they were willing to accept whatever consequences came their way. Right? And so you could argue, no, Esther, you were supposed to do that as well, right? You were supposed to do the same and just, follow God and accept the consequences. And so this is kind of what I mean when I say that the book of Esther has this, moral ambiguity, because in a sense, the book never tells us whether or not what Esther does is right or wrong. And we just don't know if God approves of what Esther did. And so as the result, I think as we walk through the book, right, I'm going to try really hard to resist the temptation, just to label Esther as a good person, or a bad person. Right? We just can't do that with the book of Esther. We can't just say that she was completely a saint or completely a sinner. We can't just label her as good or bad. Right? I think oftentimes we want to label the heroes and heroines of the Bible as, oh, these are these great guys, these great gals. Look at them, we can follow their example. But a lot of times the Bible actually paints us a picture that doesn't quite allow us to do that. And I think in many ways we have to resist the temptation, right, just to present them as these, amazing heroes, but to be honest about their flaws and commend them when we need to, and also condemn them when we need to, right? Because the truth is, and I think this is why Esther is so helpful for us, and I think this is also the brilliance of this book, is because the truth is, our lives, is also filled with moral ambiguity. Right, in the sense that not everything that we do is good and righteous and holy. Right? Sometimes we also compromise. Sometimes we also make the wrong decisions. Sometimes what we do, right, doesn't honor God. Right, but here, I think, is also the hope, of the book of Esther. Because what's this telling us is that, that what the book of Esther is teaching us, right, is that even if we feel like we've made the biggest mistake of our lives, right, even if our whole lives is filled with a lot of regret, right, even if there's so much in our lives that we hope that we could just redo, right, but the book of Esther tells us that there's still hope. Right, the book of Esther tells us that, you're never too far gone, right, for God to continue to work in you and through you for his purposes. Right, and I think this is where I really come to appreciate the book of Esther, right? Because God doesn't look at us and say, well, you made too many mistakes, right? You've been too compromised. You've too far gone. Right? No, rather, God says no matter where we are, no matter what we have done, that there's still hope, right? Because this is how great our God is. Right? We call God our Redeemer because that's exactly what God does, right? He can redeem us no matter how far away we think that we've gone from him. And so this is, really why I kind of love the book of Esther, because it simply describes to us what happens. And it's really up to us as interpreters, as listeners, as we try to apply God's word. It's really up to us to really wrestle through the good and the bad, right, of the book of Esther. And in many ways, this is also a reflection of our own lives, right? Because in many ways, our own lives is also a mixed bag, right, in terms of good and bad. But yet there's always hope to be had in God. Right, no matter what mistakes we made in our lives. And so we're going to see this as we go throughout the book of Esther, right? We just don't know. We have to wrestle with, did the person do the right thing? Did the person do the wrong thing? Is God pleased? Is God not? Right? And these are as we wrestle with that, right, I think we can benefit greatly from our own lives as well, because that's what we have to wrestle with as well, right? There's so much gray. Do I make this decision? Do I make that decision? Do I go here? Do I move here? Do I, just so many decisions in life. Right? And the book of Esther allows us to wrestle with those things. In many ways, it's a reflection of our own lives, right? The good and the bad, right? The times where we're faithful to God and times where we're not. And this is where the book of Esther really helps us to wrestle with. Now, just one more quick thing, so I'm, in many ways I'm spending time to compare Daniel with Esther. In many ways that's kind of appropriate because they're both from the same time period, right? They're both during the exile. But even though I'm comparing Daniel and Esther, in many ways I don't want you to think that it is just, a gender kind of thing in any kind of way, if you know what I mean, right? Because my goal is to simply, to very carefully and thoughtfully, or present each character, each person in the Bible as they appear, right? And I don't want to overly condemn or overly commend anyone, right? So, because we tend to do this sometimes, right? For example, sometimes we speak, super highly of King David, right? We want to present him as this, morally upright person, but yet, right, we all know that he was deeply flawed, and in many ways actually kind of disqualified himself, to be king. Right, and so we ought to think of him as he is, right, both good and bad, just in need of a savior, right, just like us. Right, on the other hand, for example, if you look at the Gospels, right, it's actually oftentimes it's the men that are represented as, arrogant and proud and ignorant. Right, if you look at the Gospels, right, the disciples, they're fighting over who is the greatest disciple. Right, they're always, completely ignorant of Jesus' teachings, right, not understanding what Jesus was saying. And oftentimes, actually, even as we walk through, the Easter series, it's actually the women in the Bible, right, that show greater faith, greater understanding, and even more boldness at times, right, than the men show. And so my point is, right, I want to do my best to present each person in the Bible as the Bible presents them to us. And I don't think we necessarily need, I don't, really feel a need or a pressure to present them as these, shining heroes, without flaws or sins, right, because I think the truth is that's true for us as well, right? But what we see in the Bible is that that God is mighty to save, right? And that's, I think, the theme that runs through the Bible, that God is mighty to save, right? And he's able to redeem us, no matter how far gone we think that we are. And so, it's a little bit of a lengthy introduction, but I did want to get that into our minds, right, before we get too much further into the book of Esther, because I think it's something that's going to come up time and time again. Or we can't just take what Esther did and be like, oh, she did it so that we can do it, or Haman, or Mordecai, or anybody, in the book of Esther. We can't just be like, okay, they did it, so that means I could do it too, right? And so this is going to come into how we apply this book to our lives, and really it creates great conversation, right? To be able to wrestle with each other, and we can disagree with each other. Why? Should they have done what they have done, right? So. And so I did want to get that into our minds, before we get too much further. So as we jump into our passage this morning, picking up from the last 2 weeks, the author is kind of introducing us week by week to all the main people of this narrative. So the very first chapter 1, we get introduced to King Ahasuerus, or I'm going to refer to him as King Xerxes, just because it's easier to say, and that's how he was known in history. And, so we get introduced to King Ahasuerus, King Xerxes. Chapter 2, we get introduced to Queen Esther, right? We go through how she was made queen. And then chapter 3, we get introduced to the third main person in the book of Esther, and that is the person of Haman, right? And so each week, right, they're introducing us to a different character in the book of Bible. And today, I introduce you to Haman, the Agagite. And, back in the day, when in certain traditions, when they would tell this, so we're going to get to this a bit later, but in the book of Esther, it would be read every single year during the period called Purim. And we're going to explain what that is. And in many traditions, some traditions, every time the name Esther is read, everybody goes, yay, all the kids go, yay, Esther. Like every time Esther comes up, yay, Esther. And then every time Haman comes up, you go, boo, because it was like read out loud, it's supposed to be interactive, right? And so as we're introducing you to Haman, boo, Haman, and so the reason why, and we're going to get, don't do that for the rest of the sermon, or else it's going to get a little bit distracting, but in this chapter, we get to meet Haman, the Agagite. But before we actually get to Haman himself, right, the Bible, Esther kind of sets up for us to introduce Haman. All right, so as we are about to be introduced to Haman, this is how the author kind of sets us up for it, with just this little detail about Mordecai. All right, so if you follow along, in chapter 2, verse 19, we get this little bit of detail about Mordecai. So it says, now when the virgins were gathered together the second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. If you remember, Mordecai is Esther's cousin who raised her. Esther had not made known her kindred or her people, as Mordecai has commanded her, for Esther obeyed Mordecai just as when she was brought up by him. Verse 21, in those days, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Bigthan and Teresh, I'm sure those are wonderful Persian names, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And this came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told it to Queen Esther. And Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. When the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were both hanged on the gallows, and it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. And then, just real quickly, just the first verse of chapter 3. After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, and advanced him and set his throne above all the officials who were with him. All right, so if you remember, the theme of the book of Esther, right? The theme as we're walking through the book of Esther is God's faithfulness in ordinary events. Right? And the idea is that, as we go through life, right, things happen to us. And sometimes we just don't know why they happen, right? But things just kind of happen to us, right? Why do we get into this school and not the other school? Why do we get rejected for this job but accepted for this one, right? Why do these seemingly random things happen to me, right? What is the purpose of these things? And the theme of the book of Esther, right, is God's faithfulness in these ordinary, mundane things of life. And what we see here is kind of just a mundane, kind of like an everyday, by chance happening, right? And Esther, right, she just so happened to be selected for the harem. And that means that Mordecai just so happened to be worried about Esther, which means that he just so happened to be walking back and forth at the king's gate, wondering what's going on with Esther. And as he's there, he just so happened to hear these two people, right, plotting to kill the king. And it just so happened that Esther was made queen, so she's in a position to tell the king, and it just so happened, right, that she was able to tell the king about the plots, and Mordecai and Esther were able to save the king's life, right? And so if you kind of look at this, everyone just so happened, right, to be in the right place at the right time for Mordecai to save the king from assassination. Now, what's the point, right? What's the point of including this little detail here in this part of the narrative? I don't want to spoil it for you, but this actually becomes a really, really important detail that's going to come into fruition a little bit later on. So this is like really big foreshadowing that's happening. But the point here is that we oftentimes don't know the reason why certain things happen to us, right? And what the book of Esther is kind of showing us is that even in these random things in life, these chance encounters that we have in life, it's all part of God's unfolding plan. Right, and we're going to get the payoff, a couple of chapters from now when this little detail is going to be super relevant. But it's interesting that right after this detail, immediately we see that the king Ahasuerus promoted Haman the Agagite. Right, and that's interesting because back before the chapter breaks kind of ruin this for us because we see the chapter and we think it's like a totally different subject. You have to remember when the book of Esther was written, right? There was no chapters or verses; it was just read continuously. And so if you read this continuously, it says, Mordecai saved the king from assassination, and then just when you expect, right, King Ahasuerus to promote Mordecai, you read immediately, and King Ahasuerus promoted Haman the Agagite, right? And Mordecai is basically left to go back into his city gates and just wander around and kind of sit there. And so the author is bringing to the forefront a kind of an injustice here as he introduces Haman, right? Because it should have been Mordecai that gets promoted, but rather, it's Haman that gets promoted here. And I think it's interesting for the author to write it this way, because the author is inviting us to meditate on the fact that sometimes when things don't go our way, right, sometimes when life is unfair, right, that we can still trust God and His plan for our lives, right? Because what happened here to Mordecai, right? He maybe, for us, right? Maybe we get passed up for a promotion and it goes to someone who's less deserving, or maybe you get passed up for an award or a recognition and it goes to someone who didn't put in that much effort, right? Or you do a school project and everyone gets the same grade, even though you did all the work, or someone else takes credit for what you did, which. I'm talking to my wife working in corporate America. That happens like all the time. People just taking credit for stuff that you do. And, in some ways, right, that the author Esther is reminding us to not lose hope, right? The way that he writes this, right? He's saying that Mordecai should have been the one that gets promoted, but doesn't. And the book of Esther is reminding us that perhaps there is a reason, right, why things are working out in your life the way that they are. Perhaps God, right, no matter what it is, even if you feel like, man, that should have been me, or I should have been the one to get promoted, right? Even when those kinds of things happen, the book of Esther is reminding us that we can still trust God in the midst of it. And so, the other day I was watching this movie called Charlie Wilson's War. I really like those kinds of movies. I don't know if you guys know it. I'm getting a lot of blank stares, but that's okay. Really good movie, really enjoy it. So anyway, so there's this quote where one of the main characters of the story is telling is telling the story of a Zen master, right? This is like in a village somewhere, who observes the people of his village celebrating a young boy's new horse as a gift. Right, so the Zen master walks into a village, and the villagers are celebrating this young boy who got a horse as a gift, which is a pretty extravagant gift. And the Zen master says, "Well, we'll see." Well, the boy falls off the horse and breaks a leg. Right, so everyone says, "Well, that horse is a curse." And the Zen master says, "We'll see." And then war breaks out, right? And the boy cannot be drafted because of his injury, right? And everyone now says, the horse was a fortunate gift. And the Zen master says, "We'll see." And it kind of ends there. But the point is, right, like the Zen master is not God because he can't see into the future. But the point is, right, we like to make some really quick conclusions about things that happen to us in our lives. Right? We see events and we like to make quick conclusions about it, but it's kind of making the same point, right? And the point of Esther is also, who knows what God may be preparing you for? Right? Who knows? Maybe he is setting you up to be in a certain time, in a certain place, to be able to accomplish his purposes in the world. Right? So the way that, the author of Esther kind of sets up this, it allows us to meditate on this fact, right? Like even when things don't go our way, even when there is a injustice in the way that we treat it, perhaps, right, maybe, right, that's still part of God's plan, and we just don't have to lose hope in what God is doing in our lives. Now, Mordecai, we talked about moral ambiguity. Mordecai could probably have used some of this advice, because Mordecai, as you'll see, is a little bit angry at the fact that Haman got promoted and he didn't. And so if you take a look at Esther chapter 3, verse 1, where it says this, it says, "After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, and advanced him and set his throne above all the officials who were with him. And all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage." Then the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why do you transgress the king's command?" And when they spoke to him day after day, and he would not listen to them, they told Haman in order to see whether Mordecai's words would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. And when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage to him, Haman was filled with fury, but he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So, as they had made known to him the people of Mordecai, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. All right, so one of the reasons why, I think, as we look at this narrative, why Mordecai didn't bow down to Haman, right, it was because Mordecai was upset, right, that Haman got promoted and he didn't. Right, but we actually see there's actually another reason, I think, why Mordecai didn't bow down to Haman, and it's a little bit more subtle. But if you notice, Haman, that I highlighted for you, when Haman is introduced, right, this is the first time Haman is introduced, he's introduced as Haman the Agagite. Right, and Mordecai is introduced as a Jew, right? And these are usually one of those names that we're like, oh yeah, he's like a father of whatever, right? He's that person. But it's actually, these details become really important because why is Agagite important? Well, the people who were Agagites were descendants of King Agag. And I don't know if that name rings a bell, but King Agag was the king of the Amalekites. The Amalekites have the unfortunate distinction of being the first people that attack Israel. So when all the way back in Exodus, right, when Israel comes out of Egypt, crosses over the Red Sea, right, and they're walking towards the Promised Land, the Amalekites were the first group of people who attacked Israel, right? And you may remember this. This is the famous account where Moses had to raise up the staff, and then, if he raised it up high, then the Israelites were winning. As his arms got tired, the Israelites were losing, and the Amalekites were winning. Right? It's that account of what happened. So they came to attack Israel, right? And so God said, put a judgment upon the Amalekites and said, I'm going to judge you, and I'm going to wipe you from the face of the earth. So fast forward a little bit. Right, in Israelites' history, and Saul is now the king. And once again, the Israelites are in battle with the Amalekites. Right, so this is the moment, right? This is where God's judgment is going to come through. So he tells Saul, I want you to destroy all the Amalekites, and don't want you to keep any of its plunder. I want you to just burn it all up, because this is my judgment against the Amalekites, right? He kind of, he allows, so there's this verse where it says he allows the sin of the Amalekites to reach its fullness, right? And then he brings forth his judgment. And so that's what King Saul is supposed to do. Now, King Saul decides that this would be a great opportunity to increase his wealth. So he saves King Agag and doesn't kill him, hoping to maybe sell him off as a bounty or kidnap him and try to trade him back as a ransom. And then he decides to keep some of the plunder for himself. And so, actually, as a result of King Saul not obeying God in this matter, King Saul is actually dethroned, and God disposes him as king of Israel. What's interesting and how that applies to us is because thousands of years later, there's still consequences to the decision that King Saul made. Right? Thousands of years later, here in the book of Esther, in the kingdom of Persia, we find this ancient battle being played out between Haman, the Agagite, right, and Mordecai, the Jew. Right? And so this is the other reason why Mordecai, I think, just could not bow down to Haman. Right, because once Haman got promoted and Mordecai didn't, right, that's one reason, but also Haman is from the long line of Agagites, right, Israel's longtime enemy. And so, again, this is kind of where the moral ambiguity comes in, right? Because, should Mordecai have just bowed down, right? If you just bow down, the story's over, right? We don't have to talk about this again. But should Mordecai have just bowed down? Did he do the right thing? Right, and it's hard to know, right? We just don't know, what this right answer should be. But due to his not bowing down, right, Haman now then plans to destroy all the Israelites who are in the kingdom of Persia, right? And this would have included the Israelites in Jerusalem, right? Because that was still part of the kingdom of Persia. And so, with all that being said, again, right, we don't know the right answer to that. But what are we to make of Haman himself? Right? What do we make of Haman himself? Well, I think in Haman, we see really the dangers of pride and power. Right? Because we really see, just think of how puffed up Haman must have been. Right? Not only does Xerxes promote Haman, right, but then he commands everyone that, hey, when Haman walks by, everyone needs to bow down to Haman. Right? You can imagine how much this must have gotten to his head. Right? He walks through the city, and everyone's just bowing down to him. And in many ways, as we see Haman, is really an abuse of power. Right? Haman is an example of someone who has way too much power and is not ready for it at all and doesn't have the maturity to handle it. And perhaps all of us can think of people, perhaps, in our lives, maybe in our workplaces or in our schools or in the governments, right, who holds position of powers when they are not really ready for it. Right? And we see when that happens, right, it is always devastating for everyone around them. But how can we apply this to our everyday lives? Because some of us might be thinking, right? Well, I don't really have that much power. I'm just a normal human being. I don't really have that much power to begin with. I'm just a nobody, right? I couldn't possibly struggle with power. But I think this is how we can apply this into our everyday lives. Because the truth is, right, you actually don't need a lot of power to have a power idolatry. Right, you actually don't need a lot of power, right, to have power be an idol in your life. Just in the same way, you don't actually have to have a lot of money, right, for money to be an idolatry in your life. Right, you don't actually have a lot of money to have a money idolatry, or you don't need to be well loved in order to have a approval idolatry. Right, you actually don't need a lot of power, right, to crave it. Right, you don't need a lot of power to want it. And so basically an idol, right, is a thing that you crave so deeply, because you believe that when you have it, when you get it, your life will finally have meaning. Right, and so how do we know if we have a power idol, right? Even as I say that, most of us are probably like, well, that's probably not me. I probably struggle with other things. So Tim Keller in his book, Counterfeit Gods, has this really helpful chart that actually is helpful in helping us discern whether or not we have this power idol in his life, right? And so this is the chart that Keller has in his book. So he says, if you have a power idol, right, meaning that your life is all about winning and success and influencing others, right? If that's your main hope in life, then your greatest nightmare is humiliation. Right now, there's a lot of reasons why your greatest greatest nightmare might be humiliation. Maybe you just care a lot about what other people think about you. But if you have a power idol, you hate humiliation, right? Because compared to others, right, you're no longer winning, you're no longer the best, you're no longer more influential than your friends or your colleagues. Right? Wanting power is all about wanting to be successful or wanting to win, wanting to have influence. Right? And so as a result, right, if you have this, right, this is questions that we can ask ourselves. As a result, people around you will often feel used. And this is actually exactly what we see here in this text. Right? Everyone around Haman and also King Xerxes feels used by them. Right? They just use the people around them for their own good and their own needs. And then it says that your problem emotion is going to be anger. Right? And we see this exactly here in this passage as well. Right? Because Mordecai refused to bow down and pay homage to Haman, Haman is so angry, right, at Mordecai for disrespecting him. Right, so I think this is helpful for us because, if I was just to ask you, right, do you struggle with power? Do you have a power idolatry in your life? Most of us probably, no, of course not. I don't have that. But these are questions to ask us ourselves, right? Is your greatest nightmare humiliation? Right? Do the people around you feel used? Right? Or are you quick to anger? And perhaps as we think through this for our own lives, right, perhaps we may realize that maybe even a little bit that we also have this heart issue like Haman does. Right, Haman gives us an example of this heart issue being fully fleshed out and it's devastating upon others. Right, but even for us, right, are these things that perhaps is also a heart issue for ourselves? Right, maybe we also crave winning and success and influence, right, thinking that once we have that, our whole life is going to really have meaning. Right, so as we look at Haman, right, it's really an example of someone who abuses his power. And because he's so angry, right, we kind of see the results. He wants to annihilate all the Jews, right, in the entire kingdom. Right, he wants to destroy all the Jews in the kingdom. And so what he does is that, just to kind of finish up our chapter, is that he casts pur. And so pur is basically casting lots, which is basically just like throwing dice. And so he needs to pick a month and a day when all the Jews will be annihilated. And so he, just casts lots. So he just throws some dice to figure out what day it will be. And it turns out it's going to be the 13th day of the 12th month. And then what he does is that he sends letters, right, to couriers to all the king's provinces with instruction to destroy and kill and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder all their goods. And then in verse 15, it says, "And the couriers went out hurriedly by the order of the king, and the decree was issued in Susa the citadel, and the king and Haman sat down to drink. But the city of Susa was thrown into confusion." Right, so the end of chapter 3 sets up the tension for the rest of the book. Right, the day is set. Right, he has cast lots. He threw some dice, and the day has been set to kill all the Jews in the kingdom. And to emphasize just how evil their plan is, right, in verse 15 it says, "And the king and Haman sat down to drink." Right, and so they were just like chilling and having a beer while this decree went out, and so it just kind of shows just how evil they were, and the whole city was thrown into confusion, right? Because they just couldn't understand why. What in the world is happening? Why would this decree all of a sudden go out into the whole kingdom? Right, so this kind of sets up the tension. What is going to happen now as we go on through the book of Esther. Now, to close our time, I just want us to briefly, consider, right? We talked about power, and I want to consider, how can we be people, right? How can we be individuals who use our power wisely, right? How can we free ourselves from the temptation, right, to maybe even use the people around us? Now, the answer, of course, is that we look to Jesus, but I think more specifically, and here's how I think it works. All right, so there's two-part sentence. All right, so first, how can we be a people that uses power wisely? I think the first thing is that we need to experience the love of the one who has ultimate authority. World leaders and presidents and dictators, they have a lot of power. Right, Haman and Xerxes, they also have a lot of power. Right, but what does Jesus say in Matthew 28? Right, Matthew 28, he says, "All authority, right, in heaven and on earth has been given to me." And the thing is, when you realize, right, that the creator of the universe, the one who has ultimate power, has all the power in the world, when you realize the creator of the universe humbled himself to be a servant, right, and died on the cross for you and me, right, I think that is where our power idolatry begins to unravel. Right, when you realize that the one who has ultimate authority used it to serve you, right, that's when each of us begins to change. Right, and so I think, how do we, use power wisely? I think first we experience the love of the one who has ultimate authority. And when you do, right, you will be empowered to do the same. One pastor puts it this way. He says that Haman sent out letters telling living people that they will die. But Jesus sends us out into the world to tell dead people that they will live. Right? Only Jesus can give us the freedom, right, to not have everything be about us, right, but allow us to use all our means as a means to serve and give to others. And I think the way that you can tell, right, if your power idolatry is kind of unraveling in your life is that when Jesus has made it to the center of your life, right, when you're humiliated, right, yes, it's still going to hurt, right, yes, it's still going to sting, right, but no longer will you be completely devastated, right, because you'll realize that you haven't lost it all, right, because Jesus is still at the center of your life, right, or if Jesus has made it to the center of your life when someone says no to you, right, instead of going straight to anger, right, because that person's not doing what you want them to do, right, perhaps you take the time to listen. Right, as Jesus, right, as we reflect, as we experience the love that Jesus has for us, Jesus actually empowers us to use our power to serve others, just as Jesus used his ultimate power to be a servant to all. Right, only Jesus can give us the freedom to use our power for the sake of others. So my friends, let us consider and let us experience, right? Let's experience how Jesus has used his power for our benefit. And as we do, we're going to be transformed to go out there and do the same and be a blessing to all those around us. Let's pray together. God, we thank you that you have given us this time each Sunday morning to be able to meditate upon your word. We thank you that your word that has been faithfully passed down to us is just full of wisdom and full of understanding, that wisdom that is above ours because this is your wisdom. And even as we wrestle through the book of Esther, and it's going to require us to really debate and think through this book and whether or not the people are living lives that are faithful to you. But yet we realize that despite, no matter what our conclusion is, Father, that we see you work through Haman, or work through Mordecai. We see you work through Esther, and we even see you being glorified through Haman and through Xerxes. That we see your great power and your great glory shining through. So, Father, I pray that you would fill us with hope, that no matter where we are, pray for my brothers and sisters here, that no matter what we have done, no matter how we think of our lives, no matter how faithful we have been to you, Father, we know that you have been faithful to us. And so, Father, would you transform us, and just as you have served us, would you give us the heart and the will to serve all those and love all those around us, as you have loved and forgiven us. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Morning again, church. If you're able, would you rise?